You are watching World Insight, and let's start with the escalating trade tensions between China and the United States. The Chinese Commerce Ministry said Wednesday that it has initiated a World Trade Organization complaint against Washington's 301 tariff investigation. That came after China earlier said it planned to impose additional tariffs of 25% on 106 U.S. products across 14 categories. The list includes soybeans, cars, and plane parts. The value of those goods were about 50 billion US dollars last year. Beijing's announcement is a direct response to Trump's move. On Tuesday, Trump administration published a list of about 1,300 Chinese exports it intends to hit with 25% tariffs. Those products are also worth about 50 billion US dollars a year, and they include software, patents, and various technologies.
China is fighting back, but only reluctantly.
We don't want a trade war. It could only hurt the interest of both China and the United States and the prospects of the world economy. At such a critical moment, it's our hope that China and the US will take a constructive approach with wisdom and mutual respect to properly cope with the problems.
The Vice Finance Minister's words came right after China announced punitive countermeasures on Wednesday, imposing 25% additional tariffs on major U.S. exports such as soybeans, cars, and aircraft. The act is in response to Washington's planned tariffs on up to 50 billion US dollars worth of Chinese imports.
The U.S. action is harmful to China's interests and economic safety. It threatens the recovery and stability of the global economy. The issuing of countermeasures is forced and measured.
The proposed U.S. list was unveiled Tuesday, bashing China's so-called coercive technology transfer practices. And the top target, Made in China 2025, an initiative opening up China's massive manufacturing sector to foreign investors. Analysts say as China becomes a technological preeminent economy, it is giving U.S. policymakers lots of pressure. Beijing said the date of implementation will depend on when Washington imposes the tariffs on Chinese products. But just as Vice Finance Minister Zhu said, one thing for sure is that a trade war will never result in a win-win situation.
Trade barriers and countermeasures. So what's next? Let's welcome our strong panel, 4 of them coming from different parts of the world. Here in Beijing, we have Zhang Jianping, once again, Director General of the Center for Regional Cooperation from the Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation with the Ministry of Commerce. So today, you got a lot to say, I guess, Mr. Zhang, from the Ministry of Commerce perspective. Mr. Teng Jianchun, who is the Director of American Studies Department at the China Institute of International Studies. He has been an expert for decades about China-U.S. relations. Welcome, sir. Also joining us in Washington, D.C., Professor Christopher Chambers, a professor of journalism from Georgetown University. I'm sure many of his colleagues are busy covering this story around the world. And finally, last but not least, in Moscow, we have Mr. Mark Sleboda, who is an international relations and security analyst, certainly helping us to understand the impact of this news from different parts of the world. Let me begin with you, Mr. Zhang, very briefly. How do you see this tit for tat? Is this violating WTO rules, or actually this has already become a bilateral issue? Mr. Zhang.
Of course, I think that this time, this so-called 301 investigation from the U.S. side actually mainly based on their domestic law instead of WTO rules and regulations, especially, even if the U.S. provided their investigation result to WTO, the problem is that they already have their, punishment, tariff list. So that means you actually didn't care about WTO. So right. I hope that the U.S. side can correct, their doing.
Professor Chambers from the U.S., we understand the Chinese has also started with its own countermeasures against the U.S. actions of having a list of 50 billion US dollars of imports coming from China with heavier tariffs. The thing is, it's about soybean, it's about agricultural products, it's also about the plane parts. So, and the cars as well. What does that mean for the U.S. economy and the businesses?
Well, if you talk about something like soybeans, that is a central pillar, if you will, of American agricultural products that spill over into other products such as pork, which a lot of farmers that voted for Mr. Trump want more pigs imported to China, and soybeans are what a lot of these animals eat. Soybeans go into a lot of the things that are important in this economy. I think that what the president is trying to do by threatening here feeds into his usual style of negotiations, which is to forget the multilateral organizations like the WTO,
right,
which he doesn't trust, and a lot of people in his administration don't care for multilateral organizations, and try to basically bully China into giving him some kind of victory that he can take back to his base, his voting base, which is a very perilous voting base.
Okay.
And and that is that's basically the sum of and substance of it here in Washington.
Mr. Sloboda, coming from Russia, I know you are also originally from the United States. Here's the thing. Commodity prices as a result of the so-called steel and aluminum tariffs, and now more coming about the soybeans, has already dragged the prices of these products going crazy, ups and downs over the days, in fact, over the past few weeks as well. So what would that mean for the world economy when the two biggest economies of the world are trying to figure out what exactly, who is abiding the laws and who is not?
Yeah, I think the rest of the world is looking at what's going on, shaking their head and wondering where the chips will fall and where the dust will settle, because we do live in a truly globalized neoliberal capitalist economy now, and the repercussions will be felt by every country, including Russia, which makes a good deal off of exports of commodities, energy and other raw commodities, particularly to China. And we've already seen dips in oil prices, and if this resulting trade war causes a reduction of U.S. consumption, Chinese demand, it's going to affect the Russian economy and knock on through economies around the world.
I see.
I think the key to understanding this is that Trump does not believe he could win a trade war or improve the budget, the trade deficit of $500 billion with China by this. This is his first step in his negotiating tactics, bluff and bluster. He wants a face-saving deal that he can bring back to his voters. His voters are working-class voters. They helped him swing the election in Rust Belt states. And he promised them that he would improve their lot in life. He understands their pain. Those are the ones who have suffered from globalization.
I see.
He really can't help them. I mean, you can't let that genie or that efreet, whatever you want to call it, is out of the bottle. But he has to present some type of face-saving mechanism for them, because the real target of this is not really China. It's the 2018 midterm elections in the United States.
All right, we all understand that political theory behind all these going on here in the United States, but America's Twitter-in-chief did weigh in on what many fear to be the beginning of, quote, a trade war between the United States and China. In a recent tweet, here's what he said. Let's show it. You probably will be able to read it about this, whether it's a trade war or the so-called trade deficit from Mr. Trump's perspective. But certainly many people think differently from his theory. And talking about many people, Professor Chambers, I want to go to you, because now the list comes out, $50 billion of tariff on goods for tariffs coming from the US, particularly those coming from China. But the thing is, it takes 60 days, that list, to solicit so-called public opinions in the United States. So this would mean people from different walks of life, in agro businesses, in cars, in planes, and in other businesses, they're going to come out and talk about this US list, whether they should punish China, quote, with tariffs. What do you expect in the next 60 days, and how do you think the dogfight inside Washington is likely to be done?
I don't know what's going to happen behind the scenes. I mean, there are already people in agribusiness, airplane parts, etc., who are talking to their friends in Congress, who are thus trying to lobby the president, because the president has gotten rid of a lot of the multilateralists in the administration and Commerce Department, State Department, etc. At this point, we just don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what the whispers are behind the scenes. Again, I don't think the president wants a trade war. I think the president wants a bilateral meeting and a deal before it escalates. The problem is, how is that going to happen when he's even making up figures like a $500 million trade deficit? That figure in itself is not accurate. So we just don't know what the situation is. This is a new territory, basically, that we're wading into, new waters.
Well, we've been wading into a lot of new territories, haven't we, over the past 1 year? Mr. Zhang, here comes to you. The list comes from the Chinese side, whether it's soybean or cars or planes. Chinese side did not either give a date about when to implement this list. So what does that mean? Is China waiting for the U.S. side to the end result of a so-called list and see how Washington will eventually come to a consensus? Is that what China is thinking about, Mr. Zhang?
Actually, for this round of trade friction, U.S. side actually they raise this friction, and also from Chinese side, we hope that we can have bilateral dialogue negotiations to solve this problem and to find solutions. And of course, if the U.S. side will implement their tariff list, maybe after 60 days, and then from Chinese side, we will take actions on that, or we will implement our list also.
I see.
But before that time point, I'm afraid that between China and the U.S., we need to take time and to promote our bilateral negotiations.
Okay, here's the thing. Mr. Tang, you've been attentive to listen to your other colleagues. Let's go to you. The Vice Minister of Commerce, Vice Minister Wang, and the Vice Minister of Finance, Vice Minister Zhu, both of them spoke today on Wednesday here in Beijing after the U.S. came up with the list to punish China with tariffs, and the Chinese also came up with another list. They both talk about if somebody wants to fight a trade war, China will fight until the end. But they also, both of them, talking about that if somebody wants to sit down for negotiation, China is willing to do that. And the door is always open. But the sword is not going to threaten China. So, Mr. Tang, what exactly is China having in mind? Is this in the middle of a negotiation strategy? Or is this a critical moment that the other side really have to think well of what it has in mind and what it wants?
First, I should say any trade friction or trade war, we have suffered a lot for both sides. For example, in the past, there were at least 5 rounds of trade friction between China and the United States. And I think the leaders and the officials in the government, in the two governments, should be very wise and they avoid the direct confrontation. And this time, I think 6 days might be long enough for the officials to think about it and find a way out of such a dilemma. But at this moment, I should say the Chinese government has been very well determined to, take countermeasures against any, violation of the international interest and China's national interest. So this is a well determined. This is a political decision. This is not only a warning from the government. I'm sure China has been well prepared also to deal with any provocative measures taken by the United States.
All right, we got some temperatures coming from China. But the thing is, what it's going to mean for the bilateral relation, we're going to come back to you, Mr. Tang, about that crucial point. But let me go to you, Professor Chambers in the US. So, what's going to be next? That has a lot to do with what this means to the international community. Because smaller and medium-sized economies around the world now, they really depend on the international rule or international rule-based mechanisms such as WTO, such as other regional mechanisms, in order to have a fair discussion with any economic powers. United States, China, Russia, or some of the biggest ones in the world. So if this rule is violated by the United States, first of all, what would that mean for the overall system? And is there going to be any room for these economies around the world when it comes to their fair share of say in the negotiation and for the future? Professor Chambers, from your perspective, sir.
Well, here in Washington, we are looking at this with a lot of concern as to how this will affect emerging and medium-sized economies that depend on this multilateral regime, such as what the World Trade Organization, the WTO, provide. I mean, this has been a growth factor for these economies for decades now. We cannot retreat into this every nation being a fortress mentality that the president and many of his more strident advisors are pushing now. I mean, and this is the problem that the Chinese will have to think about if they go into bilateral negotiations to stave off a trade war. What kind of precedent is this going to set? Because the president wants to dismantle the multilateral regime, have a lot of bilateral relationships, horse trade, as we say in the United States, within these bilateral relationships, so he can get some kind of victory and then move on to the next nation and do that. That basically destroys any advantage that an emerging or medium-sized economy is going to have.
Right.
And I don't think that he really cares about that. Again, he doesn't really care about some of the core issues he's talking about, like intellectual property or technology transfer. Those are basically excuses to start the bullying and the blustering. So I think that we're going to see some terrible things happening to emerging and medium-sized economies that aren't really going to be able to step in and say, provide China with soybeans or something like that, because they're going to be suffering as well from the fallout of this. I think everybody's very nervous right now and are looking to China to maybe provide some leadership to counter this kind of movement.
Everybody is nervous. We heard from prime ministers, presidents from many different countries just over the past 2 days or so. Mr. Zhang, here's the thing. Okay, China embraced the international system. Chinese president at the World Economic Forum and later on very different occasions embraced the existing system, want to complement with new reforms and also improvement. That's one side. But on the other side, when somebody else attacked China first, China has to respond. Well, not wait in vain. That is just a matter of human interest, right? Yes. So here's the thing. How can China handle this dilemma?
Yeah.
On the one hand, together with others, protect the international mechanism. On the other hand, make sure that nobody's going to take advantage of this and make China the victim of it. Mr. Zhang.
Firstly, I think that China will confirmly support multilateral international trade regime as well as system, as well as globalization. Meanwhile, we are also promoting, regional regime in order to promote both trade and investment liberalization and facilitation. Also, of course, for China itself, we need to promote our new round of reform and opening up in order to promote both our own development as well as other countries' development. The problem is that for the US side, you have no right to enforce China to do something because that's China's own thing.
Right.
And we will have our steps and our agenda. Another thing is that I'm afraid that from the US side, you cannot blame China's target and objective of our new strategic industries development. For China, we have our ambitious Made in China 2025. That's China's own thing. And if you think that there is a trade deficit issues, you're just focusing on trade dispute issues instead of blame other countries' industrial development plan.
Right, and China is doing this structural reform. By the way, that is about reducing the tariffs, reducing rather the trade plus and the trade surplus with the United States because it was garment, it was the shoes that was actually contributing to the surplus. Having said that, though, let me also go to you, Mr. Tang, about that. China, United States, the biggest economies in the world, the two has to work together. It's just as simple as that. If the two fight against one another, what would be the rest of the world? It's just a simple matter. So here's the thing, Mr. Tang, you are an expert on China-U.S. relations for a long time. Is there anything, any tool that we can grab right now so the two countries are really going to come to the negotiation table, or the two countries can really set a good example for all the others around the world? Mr. Tang.
First, I should say the trade deficit between China and the United States is not a result by the Chinese, capability. It's actually, division of labor.
Explain, please.
Yeah, it's just to give some, explain. Actually, both countries are trade or market-oriented, economy. And you cannot force any businessman to transfer your high tech to another company. This is actually a basic knowledge for any country, for anybody. So I don't think China has forced businessmen doing their business in China transfer their technology to Chinese company. This is a basic knowledge for any side. So I think we should think about the result. Actually, there are a lot of complementarities between the two economies in the world.
Yeah, and but where is the tool? Okay, a lot of reasoning over there, we understand. But Mr. Tang, where is the tool that would bring these two countries back to the important issues for the world, but not just go on with this tit for tat?
First, I should say we should have a new mentality towards each other, not the zero-sum game.
Can the mentality be cultivated within 60 days?
We should have a consensus at the first stage, and each side should be quite familiar with the result of such a trade, friction or trade war.
Mr. Sloboda, very briefly from you to, even though you're standing on the sideline looking at this, but this is a crucial issue, not just between two countries, but rather between what we have now and what we should have for the future, Mr. Sloboda.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of damage, a lot of flak damage that could occur to our global institutions as a result of this. Once again, the U.S. is showing its brazen contempt for international law, be that the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, or the bilateral negotiations and treaties it signs with other countries. And there certainly could be some repercussions from this. The U.S. could also face damage in its relations with other countries who look at what the U.S. is doing here and really doubt U.S. leadership. China could come out of this ahead in the perception game. And China needs to understand first and foremost that they are guest actors in a political theater that Trump is arranging, for a domestic audience. This is all about domestic politics. In order to come out ahead, China has to understand that and decide whether to give in and what to give in for a face-saving measure or to fight back. And I think they fully understand that, because if you take a close look at the products that China has put tariffs on in retaliation, a lot of those are produced in red states, sensitive states that Trump and the Republican Party needs to win. Agricultural products, whiskey, cigars, right? These indicate that China understands that, and they can hit back politically at Trump in the United States. I think they know how to play his game.
All right, before we go, we only have one sentence from every one of you. The next 60 days, what shall we watch? Very briefly, one sentence from one person. Mr. Zhang.
Yeah.
One sentence if you can, sir.
I hope the U.S. could be back on, WTO framework.
All right.
Yeah. Also, we need to promote our bilateral negotiations.
Mr. Tang.
Please be confident in the capabilities of our officials from both countries. They should have way out of dilemma.
We hope so.
In these days.
All right, Professor Chambers, one sentence.
Please, I hope the parties let the WTO take a look at this first before there are bilateral meetings.
All right, and also Mr. Sloboda, finally, one sentence.
In the next 60 days, there's only one show in town to watch, and that's Trump's Twitter feed to see where this is going.
Even though I'm not a fan of it, probably all of us will watch that, but we hope policies are being made on a sound basis, not on a shouting basis. For now, I want to thank the four of you gentlemen for being with us. Christopher Chambers, Mark Sloboda, and Zhang Jianping, Teng Jianchun. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much for being with us.